CHAPTER 10 of God's Country and the Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. God's Country and the Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 10. Not until the sound of approaching steps grew near did Josephine make an effort to free herself from Philip's arms. Unresisting, she had given him her lips to kiss. For one rapturous moment he had felt the pressure of her arms about his shoulders. In the blue depths of her eyes he caught the flash of wonderment and disbelief, and then the deeper, tenderer glow of her surrender to him. In this moment he forgot everything except that she had bared her secret to him, and in baring it had given herself to him. Even as her hands pressed now against his breast, he kissed her lips again, and his arms tightened about her. "They're coming to the door, Philip," she panted, straining against him. "We must not be found like this." The voice was booming in the hall again, calling her name, and in a moment Philip was on his feet, raising Josephine to him. Her face still was white. Her eyes were still on the verge of fear, and as the steps came nearer he brushed back the warm masses of her hair and whispered for the 20th time, as if the words must convince her, "I love you." He slipped an arm about her waist, and Josephine's fingers nervously caught his hand. Then the door was flung open. Philip knew that it was the master of Adare House who stood on the threshold, a great fur-capped giant of a man who seemed to stoop to enter, and in whose eyes, as they met Philip's, there was a wild and half-savage inquiry. Such a man Philip had not expected to see. Awesome in his bulk, a Thor-like god of the forests, gray-bearded, deep-chested, with shaggy hair falling out from under his cap, and in whose eyes there was a glare which Philip understood and which he met unflinchingly. For a moment he felt Josephine's fingers grip tighter about his own. Then, with a low cry, she broke from him, and John Adare opened his arms to her and crushed his bearded face down to hers as her arms encircled his neck. In the gloom of the hall beyond them there appeared for an instant the thin, dark face of Jean Jacques Croisset. In a flash it had come and gone. In that flash the half-breed's eyes had met Philip's, and in them was a look that made the latter take a quick step forward. His impulse was to pass John Adare and confront Jean in the hall. He held himself back and looked at Josephine and her father. She had pushed the cap from the giant's head and had taken his bearded face between her two hands. And John Adare was smiling down into her white, pleading face with the gentleness and worship of a woman. In a moment he broke forth into a great rumbling laugh, and looked over her head at Philip. "God bless my soul, if I don't almost believe my little girl thought I was coming home to murder her!" he cried. "I guess she thought I'd hate you for stealing her away from me the way you did. I have contemplated disliking you, quite seriously, too. But you're not the sort of looking chap I thought you'd be with that oily French name. You've shown good judgment. There isn't a man in the world good enough for my Joe, and if you'll excuse my frankness, I like your looks." As he spoke he held out a hand, and Josephine eagerly faced Philip. A flush grew in her cheeks as the two men shook hands. Her eyes were on Philip, and her heart beat a little quicker. She had not hoped that he would rise to the situation so completely. She had feared that there would be some betrayal in voice or action. But he was completely master of himself, and the colour in her face deepened beautifully. Before this moment she had not wholly perceived how splendidly clear and fearless were his eyes. His long blonde hair, touched with its premature gray, was still wind-blown from his rush out into the night, giving to his head a touch of leonine strength as he faced her father. Quietly she slipped aside and looked at them, and neither saw the strange, proud glow that came like a flash of fire into her eyes. They were wonderful. These two strong men were hers, and in this moment they were her own. Neither spoke for a space as they stood hand clasping hand, and in that space, brief as it was, she saw that they measured each other as completely as man ever measured man, and that it was not satisfaction alone, but something deeper and more wonderful to her, that began to show in their faces. It was as if they had forgotten her presence in this meeting, and for a moment she, too, forgot that everything was not real. Moved by an impulse that made her breath quicken, she darted to them and caught their two clasped hands in both her own. Her face was glorious as she looked up at them. "I'm glad you like each other," she cried softly. "I knew that it would be so, because " The master of Adare House had drawn her to him again. She put out a hand, and it rested on Philip's shoulder. Her eyes turned directly to him, and he alone saw the swift ebbing of the joyous light from them. John Adare's voice rumbled happily, and with his grizzled face bowed in Josephine's hair, he said: "I guess I'm not sorry, but glad, Mignonne." He looked at Philip again. "Paul, my son, you are welcome to Adare House."
"Philip, mon père," corrected Josephine. "I like that better than Paul."
"And you?" said Philip, smiling straight into Adare's eyes. "I am almost afraid to keep my promise to Josephine. It was that I should call you mon père, too." "There was one other promise, Philip," replied Adare quickly. "There must have been one other promise, that you would never take my girl away from me. If you did not swear to that, I am your enemy." "That promise was unnecessary," said Philip. "Outside of my Josephine's world there is nothing for me. If there is room for me in Adare House " "Room?" interrupted Adare, beginning to throw off his great fur coat. "Why, I've dreamed of the day when there'd be half a dozen babies under my feet. His huge frame suddenly stiffened. He looked at Josephine, and his voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "Where's the kid?" he asked. Philip saw Josephine turn at the question. Silently she pointed to the curtained bed. As her father moved toward it she went to the door, but not before Philip had taken a step to intercept her. He felt her shuddering.
"I must go to my mother," she whispered, for him alone. "I will return soon. If he asks, tell him that we named the baby after him."
With a swift glance in her father's direction she whispered still lower:
"He knows nothing about you, so you may tell him the truth about yourself, except that you met me in Montreal 18 months ago, and married me there."
With this warning she was gone. From the curtains Philip heard a deep breath. When he came to the other's side John Adare stood staring upon the sleeping baby. "I came in like a monster and didn't wake him," he was whispering to himself. "The little beggar!" He reached out a great hand behind him gropingly, and it touched a chair. He drew it to him, still keeping his eyes on the baby, and sat down, his huge, bent shoulders doubled over the edge of the bed, his hands hovering hesitantly over the counterpane. In wonderment Philip watched him, and he heard him whisper again: "You blessed little beggar!" Then he looked up suddenly. In his face was the transformation that might have come into a woman's. There was something awesome in its animal strength and its tenderness. He seized one of Philip's hands, and held it for a moment in a grip that made the other's fingers ache. "You're sure it's a boy?" he asked anxiously. "Quite sure," replied Philip. "We've named him John." The master of Adare House leaned over the bed again. Philip heard him mumbling softly in his thick beard, and very cautiously he touched the end of a big forefinger to one of the baby's tiny fists. The little fingers opened, and then they closed tightly about John Adare's thumb. The older man looked again at Philip, and from his eyes sought Josephine. His voice trembled with ecstasy. "Where is Josephine?" "Gone to her mother," replied Philip. "Bring her, quick!" commanded Adare. "Tell her to bring her mother, and wake the kid or I'll yell. I've got to hear the little beggar talk." As Philip turned toward the door he flung after him in a sibilant whisper: "Wait. Maybe you know how to do it." "We'd better have Josephine," advised Philip quickly. And before Adare could argue his suggestion he hurried into the hall. Where he would find her he had no idea, and as he went down the hall he listened at each of the several doors he passed. The door into the big living room was partly ajar, and he looked in. The room was empty. For a few moments he stood silent. From the size and shape of the building, whose outside walls he had followed in his hunt for Jean, he knew there must be many other rooms, and probably other shorter corridors leading to some of them. Just now his